The message arrived on every screen across Earth simultaneously. 15 minutes before noon, local time, worldwide. No warning, no explanation for how they'd bypassed our security, just their cold declaration displayed in perfect local languages. Your species has been evaluated and found wanting. Surrender within 48 hours. Resistance will only increase suffering. I remember exactly where I was, halfway through a shift at Mitchell Observatory, monitoring deep space signals when our instruments went haywire. The room fell silent as the message appeared, and I exchanged glances with my colleague Alex across the room. His coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. That was 3 years ago, and no one took the threat seriously at first. Most thought it was an elaborate hoax, some tech company's misguided marketing stunt, or perhaps a coordinated hack. But when massive ships appeared in orbit 24 hours later, the truth became undeniable. They called themselves the Vraxian Dominion, a species that had conquered 17 worlds before reaching ours. They hadn't expected us to say no. Dr. Chen, we're picking up movement in Sector 7. Lieutenant Rivera's voice pulled me from my memories. I blinked at the tactical display, refocusing on the present. The holographic map showed a cluster of red dots moving toward our outpost. How many? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. At least 30 scouts. Probably a reconnaissance party. I nodded, adjusting my worn lab coat. From astrophysicist to resistance strategist, not the career path I'd imagined. Alert the defense teams. Use the new frequency jammers. They won't expect that. The Vraxians had superior technology in almost every way. Almost. What they hadn't counted on was human ingenuity born from desperation. Or our sheer stubbornness. When their ground forces landed, expecting an easy conquest, they instead found a planet unwilling to bow. Every victory they claimed was paid for in blood, theirs and ours. For each city they destroyed, we adapted their own technology against them. For each human life lost, we learned another way to hurt them. The price was steep, billions dead, continents rendered uninhabitable. But humanity didn't break. That I still remember the day we captured our first Vraxian alive. Their chitinous exoskeleton, those unsettling 4 eyes, mandibles clicking with what I later learned was fear. Their translator device revealed something unexpected. They'd been told we would welcome them as superior beings. Their previous conquests had surrendered immediately. They underestimated us, General Okafor had said simply, examining the alien with clinical detachment. That will be their undoing. She was right. The bunker shuddered as distant explosions rattled the mountain above us. Our base, hidden deep within the Rockies, had remained undetected for 18 months, one of the last major coordination centers for the resistance. Dr. Chen, Rivera called again, urgency in her voice. Command wants you in Lab 3. They say the prototype is ready. My heart skipped. After countless failures, endless nights poring over salvaged alien tech, our team had finally cracked the code to their neural network. If it worked, we could potentially disable their hive mind communication system, leaving their forces scattered and confused. On my way, I replied, gathering my notes. As I hurried through the dimly lit corridors, I passed walls covered with photos, our makeshift memorial to lost loved ones. I paused briefly at one showing a smiling family at a beach, my sister, her husband, their children. All gone when Seattle fell. The lab door hissed open to reveal a team of haggard scientists surrounding what looked like a modified satellite dish. Dr. Patel looked up as I entered, dark circles under his eyes but hope evident in his expression. It works, May, he said quietly. Small-scale test confirmed. One pulse knocked out all Vraxian tech in a 5-mile radius. For the first time in months, I felt something dangerous stir in my chest. Range? I asked. If we can get it to the upper atmosphere? Continental. His voice trembled slightly. With multiple units, we could disable their entire command structure. I stared at the device, this improbable creation born from human determination and whatever scraps we could salvage. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't perfect. But it was ours. The bunker shook again, harder this time. Dust rained from the ceiling. They've found us, Rivera said from the doorway, her rifle clutched tightly. "We need to move. Now." I nodded, helping secure the prototype. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 20 minutes before they breach the outer defenses." "Just enough time, perhaps. Just enough to launch one final, desperate counterstrike that might turn the tide." As we raced to evacuate, I couldn't help but think of the Vraxians' first message. "Your species has been found wanting." They had no idea what humans were capable of when cornered. They were about to find out. The evacuation alarm wailed through the bunker as we raced down the corridor. 6 of us carried the prototype, awkward and heavy in our arms. Behind us, we could hear the distant thunder of explosions growing closer. "This way," Rivera shouted, leading us toward the emergency hangar. Her face was streaked with dirt and determination, rifle still clutched in one hand. "Transports prepped and waiting." I glanced at Dr. Patel beside me, his hands steady despite everything. He'd lost his entire family when Mumbai fell during the first wave. Yet here he was, still fighting, still believing we could win. That was the thing about humans the Vraxians never understood. Break us and we don't shatter, we forge ourselves into something stronger from the pieces. "Status report," I demanded as we reached the hangar doors. The massive steel barrier slid open with a groan, revealing organized chaos within. Technicians loaded equipment onto 3 rugged transport vehicles while armed personnel established a defensive perimeter. "Outer defenses have been breached," Captain Torres reported, joining us at the entrance. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but his voice remained steady. "We've activated the secondary explosives to slow them down. 15 minutes, maybe less." I nodded. "That'll have to be enough. The prototype is our priority." Torres's eyes lingered on the device. "Is it really worth all this? Can it actually turn things around?" "It's not just about disabling their tech," Dr. Patel explained as we carefully secured the prototype in the lead transport. "Their neural network controls everything. Weapons, ships, even their basic functions. They've become so dependent on it that without the connection, they won't know what to do," I finished. "Their entire hierarchy breaks down." The ground shook violently, sending several of us stumbling. Dust and concrete fragments rained from the ceiling. "They're using pulse cannons," Rivera warned. "We need to move. Now." I climbed into the transport beside the prototype, securing myself as the engines roared to life. Dr. Patel joined me, along with 3 armed soldiers. In the driver's seat, Rivera punched coordinates into the navigation system. "What about the others?" I asked, looking back at the dozens still in the hangar, preparing the remaining vehicles. "Second wave follows in 5 minutes, Torres explained. "We split up, different routes. Better chance of at least one group making it to the mountain base." The hangar doors began to open, revealing the night outside. Snow swirled in the darkness, obscuring the landscape, a small advantage, perhaps. "Good luck," Torres said simply, slamming the transport door shut. We lurched forward, engines straining as Rivera pushed the vehicle to its limits. Behind us, the other transports prepared to follow different escape routes. I watched the bunker entrance grow smaller in the side mirror, wondering how many would make it out alive, and why mind drifted back to the early days of the invasion. How naive we'd been, thinking conventional weapons could stop them. Nuclear deterrence had proven useless against their shields. Our most advanced aircraft fell from the sky when their systems mysteriously failed. Countries that had been enemies for generations suddenly found themselves fighting side by side against an existential threat. "Dr. Chin." One of the soldiers nudged me, pulling me from my thoughts. She offered a small metal container. "You should eat something." I accepted it with a nod, recognizing the standard ration pack. Tasteless but calorie-dense. It had been nearly 18 hours since I'd last eaten. 5 years ago, I was teaching undergraduate physics, I said quietly, opening the container. My biggest worry was whether I'd get tenure. The soldier, her name tag read Peterson, gave a slight smile. "I was in culinary school. Wanted to open a restaurant." "When this is over," Dr. Patel said, "you'll make us all a proper meal." If this is over, I thought but didn't say. The transport rocked violently, nearly throwing us from our seats. Scout ships. Rivera called from the front. They've spotted us. Through the reinforced windows, I could see sleek, insect-like craft descending through the snowstorm, their hulls gleaming with an iridescent sheen that always reminded me of beetle shells. Evasive action, ordered one of the soldiers, moving to the roof hatch where a mounted gun waited. Rivera swerved sharply, taking us off the mountain road and into dense forest. Branches whipped against the armored exterior as we crashed through the underbrush. The prototype shifted dangerously, and Dr. Patel and I lunged to secure it. How far to the rendezvous point? I called over the roar of engines and the staccato burst of gunfire from above. 20 miles, Rivera shouted back. But we've got company the whole way. A blinding flash lit up the forest ahead. One of the scout ships had deployed a light barrier, a wall of energy designed to scramble our vehicle's electronics. Hold on. Rivera yelled, slamming on the brakes and spinning the wheel hard as the transport skidded sideways through the snow. I clutched the prototype and met Dr. Patel's eyes. In them, I saw the same question that haunted all of us. Would humanity's last, desperate gamble be enough? The transport crashed through the underbrush, tipping dangerously as Rivera navigated the treacherous mountain terrain. Above us, the soldier, Peterson, fired in controlled bursts at the pursuing scout ships, the weapon's recoil rocking our already unstable vehicle. 2 o'clock. Dr. Patel shouted, pointing through the windshield. A Vraxian ship dove directly toward us, its forward cannons glowing with building energy. Rivera cursed and jerked the wheel hard left, sending us careening down a steep embankment. My stomach lurched as we went briefly airborne before slamming back to earth. The prototype shifted violently in its restraints, and I lunged to steady it. We can't outrun them forever, I said, voice tight as I checked the device for damage. Thankfully, our makeshift shock absorbers had held. We need a diversion. The other soldier, Ramirez, according to his tag, unzipped a tactical bag and removed several cylindrical objects. Scrambler grenades, he explained, noticing my gaze. Might buy us a minute or two. How many? Rivera called from the front, swerving to avoid a massive fallen tree. 3, Ramirez replied grimly. Not enough. A blast from one of the scout ships struck the ground beside us, showering the transport with dirt and stone. The vehicle rocked dangerously, threatening to tip over before Rivera somehow managed to stabilize it. Dr. Chin, Dr. Patel said quietly beside me, his voice steady despite the chaos. The prototype. Could we use it now? Just a localized pulse. I stared at him, the implications hitting me all at once. It would reveal our location to every Vraxian in 100 miles. And we'd lose the element of surprise for the main attack. If we don't make it to the rendezvous, there won't be a main attack. He was right, of course. The math was simple and brutal. How close are we to the secondary bunker? I asked Rivera. 10 miles, she replied, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. But at this rate, we won't make it half that distance. Another explosion, closer this time. The transport's rear sensors flashed warnings across the dashboard. We need to make a stand, Peterson called down from the gunner position. Somewhere defensible. Rivera's eyes darted to the navigation display. There's an old mining complex 2 miles ahead. Might give us some cover. I looked at the prototype, then at the faces around me. Each one showed the same grim determination I'd seen countless times over the past 3 years. The willingness to do whatever it took. Get us to the mines, I decided. We'll make our stand there. Rivera nodded and pushed the transport even harder. Behind us, 3 scout ships followed in tight formation, their weapons charging for another salvo. Incoming! Peterson shouted. Ramirez didn't hesitate. He hit the rear hatch release and hurled one of the scrambler grenades directly at the pursuing ships. The device detonated in a brilliant flash of blue-white energy. One scout ship immediately spiraled out of control, crashing into the dense forest. The other 2 faltered momentarily before resuming pursuit. 2 left, Ramirez reported, closing the hatch. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what failure would mean. Not just for us, we'd be dead, which seemed an increasingly likely outcome, but for humanity. The prototype represented years of clandestine research, countless lives sacrificed to obtain the Vraxian tech we'd reverse-engineered. If it was destroyed, there wouldn't be time to build another before the aliens completed their new orbital weapon. The mining complex appeared ahead, a collection of weathered concrete buildings nestled against the mountainside. Rivera drove directly for the largest structure, smashing through a pair of rusted gates. "Everyone out," she ordered as the transport skidded to a halt inside what had once been some sort of processing facility. "Grab everything you can carry." We moved with practiced efficiency, each knowing our role. Dr. Patel and I carefully disconnected the prototype from its mount while the soldiers gathered weapons and equipment. Rivera quickly surveyed our surroundings, identifying defensible positions. "Main tunnel entrance is there." She pointed toward a dark opening in the far wall. "We can set up a choke point." The distinctive whine of the scout ships grew louder outside. They'd found us. "Move," Rivera commanded, already heading for the tunnel. "Ramirez, rear guard." We hurried into the darkness, the weight of the prototype awkward between Dr. Patel and me. Peterson took point, activating a tactical light to illuminate our path. Behind us, Ramirez backed slowly toward the tunnel, weapon raised. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber filled with abandoned mining equipment. Ancient conveyor belts and/or crushers created a maze of potential cover. "Perfect," Rivera muttered, quickly assessing the space. "Set up the prototype there, behind that crusher. Peterson, watch our backs. Dr. Chin, how long will you need?" I exchanged glances with Dr. Patel as we carefully placed the device on a flat section of concrete. 10 minutes to power up, maybe 5 more to calibrate. But Rivera, I hesitated. A pulse from here won't reach the rendezvous point. They won't know if we succeeded or failed. "Let me worry about that," she replied, checking her weapon. "Just get that thing working." Dr. Patel and I immediately began the startup sequence, connecting power cells and initializing the targeting system. From the tunnel entrance, we heard the first exchanges of gunfire. "They're coming," Ramirez called, backing into the chamber. "At least a dozen ground troops." Rivera took position behind an overturned mining cart. "Hold them at the entrance as long as possible." The distinctive chittering sound of Vraxian communication echoed through the tunnel, followed by the sharp report of their plasma weapons. Ramirez dove for cover as energy bolts scorched the rock where he'd been standing. 5 more minutes, Dr. Patel said tensely as the prototype's core began to hum with building power. I nodded, fingers flying across the makeshift control panel. The irony wasn't lost on me, using salvaged alien technology to fight the very beings who created it. Humanity had always been good at adaptation, at turning an enemy's strength into a weakness. The firefight intensified at the tunnel entrance. Peterson grunted in pain as a plasma bolt grazed her arm, but she maintained her position, returning fire with methodical precision. "They're flanking us," Rivera shouted. "Second tunnel on the right." I hadn't even noticed the smaller passage. Now Vraxian troops poured from it, their insectoid forms moving with unnatural speed in the dim light. "Almost there," Dr. Patel urged as the prototype's indicator lights shifted from red to amber. 30 seconds to full charge." Ramirez cried out as a plasma bolt caught him square in the chest, flinging him backward. He didn't get up. The Vraxians advanced, chittering excitedly as they gained ground. Their mandibles clicked rhythmically, a sound I'd learned meant they were communicating tactical information through their neural network. 15 seconds. I said, voice steady despite the chaos around us. Rivera abandoned her position to drag Ramirez's body behind cover. "Peterson, fall back to the device." The lights on the prototype shifted to green. "Power at maximum." "Ready," Dr. Patel announced, his finger hovering over the activation switch. A plasma bolt struck the ground inches from the prototype, sending sparks flying across the control panel. Another hit the crusher above us, showering us with molten metal. "Do it now," Rivera screamed as the Vraxians closed in from both sides. Dr. Patel looked at me, a question in his eyes. If we activated the pulse here, the element of surprise for the main attack would be lost. But if we died, the prototype died with us. Sometimes, survival meant making impossible choices. Do it, I nodded at Dr. Patel pressed the switch. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, nothing happened. Dr. Patel's finger remained on the switch, our eyes locked in silent understanding. Then the prototype emitted a high-pitched whine, building rapidly in intensity until I had to cover my ears. A blast of invisible energy erupted outward in concentric rings, sending dust and debris swirling across the chamber. The effect on the Vraxians was immediate and unsettling. They froze mid-attack, their limbs twitching erratically. The chittering communication abruptly ceased. Several dropped their weapons, mandibles working frantically as if trying to speak but finding themselves suddenly mute. "It's working," Dr. Patel whispered, awe in his voice. Rivera didn't waste the opportunity. She fired methodically at the confused aliens, dropping 3 before the others retreated in disarray back toward the tunnels. "They're completely disoriented," Peterson observed, keeping her rifle trained on the entrance. "Like they don't know what to do without orders." I studied the prototype's readouts, shocked by what I was seeing. The disruption is stronger than we predicted. Their neural network is completely offline in this area. Rivera moved to check on Ramirez, but the grim set of her mouth told us what we already knew. Another name for the memorial wall, if we ever made it back to share the news. "How long will it last?" she asked, rejoining us. 30 minutes, maybe less, Dr. Patel replied. "After that, the power cells will be depleted." Rivera nodded, her mind clearly working through our limited options. "Then we need to move. While they're disorganized." "The rendezvous point is still 8 miles away," Peterson pointed out. "We'll never make it on foot, especially carrying the prototype." "We don't need to," Rivera said, a spark of something like hope in her eyes. "Look." She pointed to the readout on her tactical pad. The pulse affected their ships too. 2 are completely disabled, but the 3rd landed intact about half a mile from here. My breath caught. "You want to steal a Vraxian scout ship?" "No human has ever flown one," Dr. Patel objected. "Actually," Rivera said quietly, "that's not entirely true." We all stared at her. "Operation Mockingbird," she continued. "Classified project from about a year ago. A team managed to capture a damaged scout ship. Before the base was overrun, they transmitted partial flight data." "And you've seen this data?" I asked. Rivera nodded. "I was part of the recovery team sent to extract any survivors. There weren't any, but I memorized the control schematics before we had to destroy the evidence. It was a desperate plan, possibly suicidal, but we were out of alternatives. Let's do it, I decided. Peterson, help us with the prototype." We moved quickly, gathering what supplies we could salvage. The prototype was awkward but lighter now that most of its power had been expended. Outside the mining complex, the night was eerily silent. No pursuing ships, no alarm signals. Just darkness and gently falling snow. "This way," Rivera whispered, leading us through the trees. We moved as quietly as possible, knowing that Vraxian ground troops might still be functional, just disconnected from their central command. The scout ship appeared suddenly through the snow, sleek and predatory, its iridescent hull reflecting the moonlight. No sign of movement around it. "Wait here," Rivera ordered, then crept forward alone to investigate. Tense minutes passed before she waved us forward. "The pilot's dead," she explained as we approached. "Looks like the neural disruption caused some kind of feedback in their neural implants." I tried not to look too closely at the Vraxian corpse as we climbed aboard the alien craft. Its interior was disorienting, designed for beings with different proportions and a different number of limbs. Everything was covered in strange, glowing symbols and organic-looking interfaces. "Give me a minute," Rivera muttered, studying the control panel. She pressed several surfaces experimentally, and the ship hummed to life. This is similar to the schematics I memorized." The ship rose unsteadily, Rivera clearly struggling with the unfamiliar controls. We ascended above the treeline, the mountainous landscape spreading out below us. "Can you find the rendezvous point?" I asked, securing the prototype as best I could in the strange interior. I think so, Rivera replied, her face illuminated by the alien consoles. The navigation system is actually fairly intuitive once you... A violent impact rocked the ship, throwing us against the walls. Warning symbols flashed across the control panels in angry red. What was that? Peterson demanded, weapon raised though there was nothing to shoot at. Look. Dr. Patel pointed through the view portal. My blood ran cold. Above us, emerging from the cloud cover, was a Vraxian battlecruiser, a massive vessel I'd only ever seen in reconnaissance photos. It dwarfed our stolen scout ship like a whale next to a minnow. How? I whispered. The pulse should have disabled all their tech in the area. It must have been outside the effective radius, Dr. Patel theorized, his voice tight. And now they've sent reinforcements. The battlecruiser fired again, a warning shot that passed close enough to make our ship shudder. They're not trying to destroy us, Rivera realized, wrestling with the controls. They want to capture us. And the prototype. A third shot, this one precise. Our engines sputtered and died. The scout ship began to descend, no longer under our control. They're using a tractor beam, Rivera said grimly. I looked at the prototype, then at my companions. We can't let them take it. If they analyze it, they'll develop countermeasures. All our work will be for nothing. So we destroy it, Peterson suggested. That I shook my head. No. There's another option. I met Dr. Patel's eyes, and I could see he'd reached the same conclusion. The power cells aren't completely depleted, he said slowly. There's enough for one more pulse. But we'd need to overload the containment field, I continued. The resulting surge would be, like a bomb, he finished. Rivera looked back at us, understanding dawning. You're talking about turning the prototype into a weapon. Not just any weapon, I explained, already opening the prototype's maintenance panel. The pulse would be exponentially stronger. It might not just disable their neural network, it could fry it completely. Permanently. And if that battlecruiser is what I think it is, Dr. Patel added, it's a command vessel. Their highest-ranking officers would be aboard. The implications were staggering. With their command structure decimated, the remaining Vraxian forces would be thrown into chaos. How long would it take? Rivera asked, her voice steady despite our predicament. 5 minutes to reconfigure, I estimated. But there's a catch. Of course there is, Peterson muttered. Someone needs to manually trigger the overload, I explained. The detonator will be fried by the initial surge. There's no remote option. Silence fell in the scout ship as the meaning of my words sank in. Whoever triggered the device wouldn't survive. Our descent accelerated. Through the viewport, I could see the battlecruiser's docking bay opening to receive us. 4 minutes until we're aboard their ship, Rivera reported the doctor. Patel and I worked frantically, rewiring the prototype's internal components. Peterson kept watch, though there was little she could do if more Vraxians appeared. The tension in the small craft was thick enough to cut with a knife. Done, I announced finally, stepping back from the modified device. A crude detonator now protruded from its side, a simple mechanical switch that would overwhelm the power cells and trigger the overload. That we all stared at it, understanding the choice before us. I'll do it, Rivera said, breaking the silence. I'm a soldier. This is my job. No, Peterson countered. You're the only one who can fly this thing if we somehow break free. It has to be me. Before anyone could respond, the scout ship jerked violently. We'd entered the battlecruiser's docking bay. Through the viewport, I could see dozens of Vraxian soldiers arranging themselves in formation, weapons ready. Behind them stood a larger Vraxian, its exoskeleton adorned with metallic elements I'd never seen before. Some kind of high-ranking officer. We're out of time, Dr. Patel whispered. That a harsh sound echoed through the scout ship, the outer airlock being overridden. They're coming aboard, Rivera warned, drawing her sidearm. The 4 of us exchanged glances, a lifetime of unspoken understanding passing between us in seconds. Each of us knew what needed to be done. The question was who would do it. That I reached for the detonator point. 3 hands grabbed my wrist simultaneously. Rivera, Peterson, and Dr. Patel all reached for me at once. their faces set with the same stubborn determination. "Not you," Rivera said firmly. "You designed it. You're the only one who can rebuild it if this fails." The ship shuddered as docking clamps locked into place. The sound of the outer door being forced echoed through the cramped space. "There's no time to argue," Dr. Patel said. His usually calm eyes were fierce now. "We need a diversion. Rivera, Peterson, you two create a distraction. Dr. Chen and I will handle the prototype." The soldiers exchanged a brief glance, then nodded in unison. Some unspoken communication passed between them, the kind that only comes from facing death together too many times. "On my mark," Rivera said, positioning herself beside the inner airlock. 3, 1. The airlock slid open. Rivera and Peterson opened fire immediately, catching the first Vraxians by surprise. Their chitinous bodies fell backward, creating momentary confusion among their ranks. "Go," Dr. Patel urged, pulling me toward a maintenance access panel he'd spotted earlier. We slipped through while Rivera and Peterson advanced, drawing the Vraxians' attention. The narrow maintenance shaft led deeper into the battlecruiser. We crawled rapidly, the prototype awkward between us, guided only by the dim emergency lighting. "This is actually better," I whispered as we moved. "If we can reach their central command node, the pulse will be even more effective." Behind us, the sounds of calm. That faded, replaced by alarm signals pulsing through the ship. Rivera and Peterson had bought us precious time, but at what cost? "Here," Dr. Patel said suddenly, pointing to a junction where several thick cables converged. "These must lead to something important." We followed the cable bundle until we reached a sealed doorway marked with Vraxian symbols. "Can you read any of it?" Dr. Patel asked that I shook my head. "But look at the security measures. Whatever's behind that door matters to them." The panel beside the door was complex, clearly designed to keep unauthorized users out. But 3 years of studying Vraxian technology had taught me a few tricks. "Cover me," I said, pulling a small toolkit from my pocket. Dr. Patel positioned himself to watch both directions of the corridor while I worked. It took precious minutes to bypass the security, all while knowing that Vraxian soldiers could appear at any moment. Finally, with a soft hiss, the door slid open. "My God," Dr. Patel breathed that we found ourselves in a vast chamber dominated by a pulsing organic-looking structure. Glowing filaments extended outward like neural pathways, connecting to various interfaces around the room. The air hummed with energy. "This is it," I realized with growing excitement. "Their central neural hub for this entire battlecruiser." Dr. Patel carefully set down the prototype. "If we detonate it here, it would cascade through their entire command structure," I finished. "Maybe even reach other ships in their fleet." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about disabling a single battlecruiser anymore. This could cripple their entire invasion force. As I began final adjustments to the prototype, the door behind us slid open. We spun around, expecting Vraxian soldiers, but instead saw Rivera, her face bloodied but triumphant. "Peterson?" I asked, already knowing the answer from Rivera's expression. "She bought us time," Rivera said simply. "What's the plan?" I quickly explained what we'd discovered as I continued working on the prototype. "The detonator's ready, but someone still needs to trigger it manually." Rivera nodded, her decision already made. "That's me. You two need to find a way off this ship." "There's an escape pod 2 corridors back," she continued before we could argue. "I saw it during the firefight. Standard Vraxian design. Even I can't fly their main ships, but their escape pods are simple. Get to the rendezvous point. Tell them what happened here." A harsh alarm blared through the chamber. Our presence had been detected. "Go," Rivera urged, taking position beside the prototype. "Now." Dr. Patel hesitated, then clasped Rivera's shoulder. No words were necessary that I found myself unable to move, frozen by the weight of what was happening. Rivera would die here, alone, surrounded by enemies. "May," she said, using my first name for the first time. "Humanity needs you alive." "Not me." "Lieutenant Rivera," I began. "Anna," she corrected with a small smile. "My name is Anna." The sound of approaching Vraxians echoed down the corridor. "Go!" she shouted, raising her weapon. Doctor Patel grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit. I caught one last glimpse of Rivera, Anna, standing tall beside the prototype, her face set with fierce determination. That we ran through the corridors, following Rivera's directions to the escape pod. Twice we had to hide from Vraxian patrols, pressing ourselves into maintenance alcoves as they passed. The escape pod was exactly where Rivera had said it would be, a small, ovoid craft attached to the outer hull. Dr. Patel quickly figured out the release mechanism while I secured the hatch behind us. "How long do you think we have?" he asked as we strapped ourselves in. "Not long," I replied. "Minutes, maybe seconds." The pod's controls were simple enough that even with our limited knowledge of Vraxian technology, we managed to initiate the launch sequence. With a violent jerk, the pod detached from the battlecruiser. Through the small viewport, I watched the massive alien vessel grow smaller as we drifted away. Any moment now, Rivera would activate the prototype. "I hope she waits until we're far enough away," Dr. Patel murmured. That I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I agreed. What was our survival compared to the potential to cripple the invasion force? Seconds stretched into minutes. The battlecruiser remained intact, hanging ominously in space. "Something's wrong," I said finally. "She should have." The universe exploded in light. The pulse was visible even to our human eyes, a rippling wave of energy expanding outward from the battlecruiser. It washed over our escape pod, momentarily disrupting the minimal electronics before passing harmlessly onward, but its effect on the battlecruiser was catastrophic. Sections of the massive ship went dark in sequence, like a wave of blackness spreading across its hull. Secondary explosions bloomed along its flanks as systems overloaded. "It worked," Dr. Patel whispered in awe. "The neural disruption." I watched in stunned silence as the Vraxian flagship began to list to one side, clearly dead in space. Other Vraxian vessels in the distance seemed similarly affected, their lights flickering and movement ceasing. Our small pod continued its descent toward Earth, the navigation system somehow still functional enough to maintain course. Below, the snow-capped mountains grew larger. "We need to contact the rendezvous point," Dr. Patel said, searching the pod for anything resembling a communication device. That I helped him search, but my mind was elsewhere, with Rivera, with Peterson, with Ramirez. With all the others who'd given their lives to reach this moment. The pod shuddered as it entered the lower atmosphere, the exterior heating with friction. I braced myself for a rough landing, hoping the Vraxian craft was designed to withstand impact better than our human vehicles. "There!" Dr. Patel suddenly exclaimed, pointing through the viewport. Below us, in a clearing among the trees, flares had been lit in a precise pattern, the recognition signal for our forces. "They're waiting for us," I realized. But how could they know we'd be in a Vraxian escape pod? The landing was jarring but survivable. The pod skidded across snow and ice before coming to rest against a stand of pine trees. Smoke curled from its exterior, but the hull remained intact. Dr. Patel helped me unfasten the safety restraints, then struggled with the release mechanism for the hatch. With a hiss of escaping pressure, it finally popped open, letting in a rush of cold, fresh air. Armed figures surrounded the pod immediately, weapons trained on the opening. I raised my hands instinctively. "Dr. Chin?" a familiar voice called. "Dr. Patel?" General Okafor stepped forward, lowering her sidearm. "How did you know to expect us?" I asked as we climbed out of the pod on shaky legs. The general's expression was unreadable. "We didn't." "Not exactly." She gestured toward the sky. But when every Vraxian ship in orbit suddenly went dark, we figured something had happened. "The prototype worked," Dr. Patel explained. "Lieutenant Rivera sacrificed herself to detonate it aboard their Commandus." "Hip." Okafor nodded solemnly. "Her name will be remembered." She turned to address her team. "Get them inside. Debrief in 10 minutes. As we were led toward a camouflaged bunker entrance, I looked back at the night sky. The stars seemed clearer somehow, no longer obscured by the constant presence of alien ships. "Is it over?" Dr. Patel asked quietly. "Have we won?" I considered his question carefully. No, I replied finally. But for the first time, I think we might actually have a chance. We entered the bunker, leaving the damaged Vraxian pod behind. Inside, dozens of resistance fighters were gathered around communication equipment, many cheering as reports came in from around the globe. Vraxian forces everywhere were in disarray, their coordinated attacks suddenly transformed into isolated pockets of confused aliens. General Okafor led us to a small, private room where a tactical display showed the current situation. What I saw made my breath catch. This can't be right, I said, studying the data. It is, Okafor confirmed. The pulse didn't just disable their neural network. It revealed something we never knew existed. The display showed thousands of tiny signals emanating from Vraxian-occupied territories worldwide, signals that hadn't been detectable before. What are they? Dr. Patel asked. People, Okafor said simply. Humans. Alive. I stared at her in disbelief. But the occupied zones, we thought no one survived. So did they, came a voice from the doorway that we turned to see a figure silhouetted against the light from the corridor. As they stepped forward, I gasped in shock. Rivera stood before us, battered and burned, but unmistakably alive. How? I managed, certain I was hallucinating from exhaustion. The Vraxians have been keeping prisoners, she explained, her voice hoarse. Thousands of them, using their neural network to suppress any sign of their presence. When I triggered the prototype, the suppression field collapsed. That's when I discovered I wasn't alone on that ship. Human prisoners helped you escape, Okafor finished. And they're not the only ones. Reports are coming in from every occupied territory. The people we thought were dead have been there all along, hidden by Vraxian technology. And now they're fighting back, Rivera added, a fierce light in her eyes. The Vraxians never understood what they were doing when they tried to conquer us. They thought taking our technology, our cities, our resources was enough. She stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. But they never realized that humanity's greatest weapon isn't something you can see or touch or disable. It's hope. And they just gave it back to us. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. A new day. Perhaps a new beginning. The Vraxians had made a critical mistake when they came to our world. They had evaluated humanity and found us wanting. They were about to learn just how wrong they'd been. 2 months after what people now called the Great Disruption, I stood on the roof of the reclaimed Mitchell Observatory. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and something else. Hope, perhaps. Below me, a makeshift community had sprung up around the facility, filled with survivors and resistance fighters working together to rebuild. Rivera joined me at the railing, her injuries mostly healed save for a new scar that ran along her jawline. She'd refused medical leave, insisting on leading the recovery operations herself. The reports from Asia came in, she said, passing me a tablet. Seoul has been completely reclaimed. That's the 12th major city this month. I scanned the data, still amazed by how quickly the tide had turned. And the Vraxian prisoners? Contained and being studied. Without their neural network, they're different. More individual. Some are even attempting to communicate. The concept still unsettled me, the idea that our enemy might not be entirely what we thought. Were they all willing participants in the invasion, or simply extensions of a collective will? Questions for another day. And what about the people they kept prisoner? I asked. That's actually why I came to find you, Rivera replied, a rare smile touching her lips. Dr. Patel wants you in Lab 2. Says it's important. The newly established labs occupied what had once been storage facilities. I found Dr. Patel hunched over a workstation, surrounded by a mix of human and salvaged Vraxian technology. He looked up when I entered, exhaustion and excitement warring on his face. You need to see this, he said without preamble, gesturing to a holographic display. The image showed neural patterns, human neural patterns, alongside what appeared to be suppression algorithms. This is how they did it, Dr. Patel explained. How they kept thousands of humans hidden from our sensors. The Vraxians weren't just controlling their own neural network, they were manipulating ours too. I studied the data, understanding slowly dawning. They were suppressing certain neural pathways? Making the prisoners, what? Invisible to us somehow. Not just invisible. Forgot. N. Dr. Patel's voice was hushed with the weight of discovery. The Vraxians developed technology that could alter how our brains perceive reality. They made us forget those people existed. The implications were staggering. But the prototype disrupted that too. Exactly. When we overloaded their neural network, we didn't just free the prisoners from physical captivity, we freed everyone from a kind of perceptual prison. No wonder the resistance had grown so quickly after the Great Disruption. It wasn't just the prisoners joining the fight, it was everyone suddenly remembering what had been taken from them. Can they do it again? I asked, the question more urgent than any other. If they rebuild their network, that's what I wanted to show you, Dr. Patel interrupted, switching to a different display. We've been studying their technology. The neural manipulation requires incredible precision and consistent reinforcement. Without their command ships maintaining the signal. He shook his head. They can't just start over. And we now know what to look for. Relief washed through me, replaced quickly by determination. We need to share this with General Okafor immediately. Every resistance cell worldwide needs this information. 3 days later, I stood before the newly formed Global Defense Council, a patchwork organization of military leaders, scientists, and civilian representatives from every continent. General Okafor had insisted I present our findings personally. The Vraxians aren't defeated, I told them bluntly. Their ground forces are scattered and disorganized, but they're adapting, learning to operate without their neural network. And we've detected communications suggesting their homeworld has been notified of the situation. Murmurs spread through the assembled leaders. But we have advantages now that we didn't have before, I continued. We understand their technology better. We've liberated their prisoners, many of whom spent years observing Vraxian behavior and tactics from the inside. And most importantly, we have proof that humanity can win. I shared the data Dr. Patel and I had compiled, explaining the neural suppression technology and how we might guard against it in the future. As I spoke, I watched hope and determination replace fear on the faces before me. The road ahead is long, I concluded. Reclaiming our world will take time. But the Vraxians made a fundamental error in their assessment of humanity. They saw our divisions, our conflicts, our apparent weakness, and thought us easy prey. They never understood what happens when humans are pushed to the edge of extinction. We don't break. We adapt. We overcome. And we never, ever give up. The council chamber erupted in determined applause. As the noise settled, plans were already being formulated for recovery, for defense, for the eventual push to remove the Vraxian presence from Earth entirely. Later that evening, I found myself back at the observatory, watching the stars emerge one by one. Somewhere out there was the Vraxian homeworld. Somewhere out there, they were probably planning their next move. Let them come, I thought. We'll be ready. Rivera appeared beside me, 2 steaming mugs in hand. She offered one silently, and we stood together, watching the night sky. You know what I keep thinking about? She said finally. That first message they sent. Your species has been evaluated and found wanting. I nodded, remembering how it had appeared on every screen worldwide. How arrogant it had seemed even then. I wonder if they regret it, Rivera continued. If they realize now what they awakened with those words. I thought about the prototype, about Rivera's sacrifice that wasn't really a sacrifice, about the thousands of prisoners suddenly remembering who they were. About humanity, pushed to the brink only to come back stronger. Maybe that's the lesson here, I said quietly. Never challenge humanity unless you're prepared for the consequences. Rivera smiled, raising her mug in a silent toast. Above us, the stars continued their age-old vigil, bearing witness to a world forever changed, and to a species that refused to be conquered. The Vraxians had made their choice. Now they would live with the consequences or die by them.